Gemini release, joining ChatGPT and adding a memory feature that will allow it to remember some of your personal and work interests so it can personalize its responses.
Google launched image generation built into Google Docs to replace clip art.
Microsoft has announced Copilot Actions. They also launched what they call Copilot Studio.
ChatGPT and macOS can now see other applications and interact with them.
Stripe this week launched an agent toolkit, a framework for integrating an AI agent into a third-party service.
Perplexity launched 2 shopping-related features. Snap to Shop. Buy with Pro. You can buy items with just a single click. The study involving 50 doctors who had ChatGPT available to them, doctors who did not have ChatGPT, and then they had ChatGPT on its own. The most accurate diagnosis tool was ChatGPT on its own.
Notebook LM from Google. It is a service where you can upload PDFs or YouTube videos.
And instead of summarizing it in text, it can make it into a podcast.
Welcome to What the AI, where we decode the latest developments in artificial intelligence for busy professionals. I'm Jeff Keltner.
And I'm Annie Delgado.
Hey, Annie, how you doing?
Great, Jeff. How you doing?
I'm good. You ever have that experience where you walk into a room and just don't even know why you're there?
Yes, that happens to me routinely. Or actually more commonly for me is I live in a 2-story home and I walk downstairs, can't remember why I'm there. So I walk back upstairs and then I remember and walk downstairs. So I get so many stair steps in. It's great.
I mean, upsides, I've gotten to the point now where I just like stand there still until it comes to me why. Like I walk in the room, I go, why am I here? I used to just leave and come back when it came to me. Now I'm like, no, I'm just going to stand here until I remember I'm here.
What's the over under on how long you'll stand there?
Probably about a minute. I mean, that's probably my pain threshold, but like usually 15 or 20 seconds. So my kids just look at me like, I'm like, no, I'm good. It's going to come to me. I'm determined.
I like it.
But this has me excited for the latest Gemini release, joining ChatGPT and adding a memory feature for those of us whose memories sometimes fail that will allow it to remember some of your personal and work interests and preferences. Things like if you're a vegetarian, recommending vegetarian restaurants, things like that, the kind of work you're in, so it can personalize its responses. So it's kind of cool.
That's very cool. I mean, we talked about the ChatGPT memory a few weeks ago and use cases for that. I think it's cool to see Gemini also join in.
It's a little bit behind the party, but it's coming.
A little bit behind the party, but it's there. In other Google news, Google launched image generation built into Google Docs to replace clip art. Super excited about this. I gave it a try this morning. I have to admit, I'm still somewhat underwhelmed by the AI image generation. It can't ever do exactly what I'm looking for, but it's getting closer. And it's
getting
becoming more
closer.
Mainstream, having it built into the actual tool that you're using. Have you played around
Yeah.
with it?
I've played around with it. It's pretty good. It definitely, it depends on if your bar is like, Monet or clip art. If it's clip art, it's not bad.
Fair enough. I think that's true for a lot of things in life. You just have to adjust your expectation and then you will be delighted as opposed to disappointed.
I've used the feature of this built into like ChatGPT or Gemini a few times where I literally have posted a social media post or a blog post and said, hey, here's my post. Like, could you kind of image that kind of like somewhat represents this? And you go through a couple iterations. It's not too bad. It's certainly better than I could do on my own.
Yes, if the bar was me drawing, it's clearly better than that, 100%. So, 100%.
Well, while we're talking about smaller sized updates, Microsoft has announced Copilot Actions at their Ignite conference this week. These are new. We talked about agents, I think, last week, agentic behavior. This was a series of both pre-built agents that can do things like self-service for HR or IT tasks, searching things like SharePoint or documents, meeting note takers. So it was interesting. Those felt like things that I already had the ability to do, so it didn't feel as new and agentic as maybe some things. They also launched tools for developers to build custom agents in what they call Copilot Studio. They're really leaning into this Copilot brand. I like the brand, but they're going hard on the Copilot branding, including agents that can run autonomously in the background to kind of do things without being asked on a regular cadence. Give you a review of monthly statistics or weekly dashboards kind of thing. So that was interesting.
Yeah, super interesting. Actually, we've talked a little bit about the branding topic. I think Copilot might be one of my favorite branding of all the different LLMs. I think it's a good one.
Well, I think it's such a great description of how at least Microsoft envisions you using this, right? It actually came out of the first product to have that brand name was GitHub, owned by Microsoft, but they call it Copilot. But the idea that it's kind of there to help on the side and also critically, to your point about the Google update, integrated into the tools you're already using, right? It's kind of you're in Word, you're in PowerPoint, you're in SharePoint, and there's a little helpful tool that's gonna be there to help you, not replace what you're doing, but help make it easier for you to get things done. So I thought that branding and that conceptualization, I guess, of what the AI is gonna do and how it fits is pretty interesting.
Yeah, yeah, I like it. In more agent news and potentially more real world agent news, ChatGPT and macOS can now see other applications and interact with them. So we talked about this kind of a deep dive a few weeks ago about agents and computers working with each other. So far, what we're seeing here is all sort of coding related
Yeah.
use cases. Have you seen this too?
I've played with it. It's pretty cool. So, if you remember, Anthropic released a very early version of Use Your Computer. And that was interesting when I used it. What it did was kind of create screenshots of what's on your screen. And you could tell it, hey, do this thing. And it'll control the mouse, but it's really taking a screenshot and saying, where should I click to do X? And trying to just use the computer. The ChatGPT integration is with a handful of apps. Terminal and Visual Studio Code is the one I used, and it's pretty cool because you have to kind of do an authentication on the back end, and then ChatGPT actually says, using alongside whatever it is, Visual Studio Code, and then it can see everything in that app and actually interact with the app. So you can say, "What are these lines of code that I'm looking at mean?" And it'll know where your cursor is, and it can read the code, and it can explain to you what it's doing. It can make edits or suggest edits. So it was a really kind of cool. I mean, I think this use case in particular was an interesting example because compared to our Copilot, I also had GitHub Copilot, which is a chat window built into Visual Studio Code that runs to do the exact same things without being applications just built into Visual Studio Code. So I actually ran them side by side, a little Python notebook, and had both. And it's an interesting question to me about are we going to have something like ChatGPT that owns the whole experience and is connecting to other apps, or are these things going to get integrated into the place that you're already working, so that they're just kind of part of the workflow? It's a bit undetermined how that's going to play out. I think.
Yeah, or both possibly, right? Different types of use cases. I would love to see a future where non-software engineers could just generate high quality code to get them to do, different things. Small businesses can generate high quality code. And I think that's probably a different sort of interface and use case than what a traditional software engineer might use and have it integrated into tools that they're already working with. So we'll see.
Well, there's in that vein, maybe we'll do one of our hands-on later, but there are a few tools out there that are literally just tell me the app you want, and it writes all the code, and it still shows you the code that's being written, so it feels a little developery, but you can literally just use plain text to go, and I've seen some examples where people take entire product description, like a 5 or a 10-page just Word document that's got a description of what the app should do and how it should look and what the interface should be, and this thing just goes and iterates through the large language model, writes the code, and then you can go, "Hey, you've got this button that doesn't do anything. When a user clicks it, it should do this." And it'll go update the code. So I think we're getting there. Into I think we've had this discussion before, but I think your point is exactly on target, which is it's not about replacing developers. It's about giving access to the ability to build software tools to companies that don't have developers, to users that aren't developers. And that to me is where the real power of these models is going to lie.
100%. I think the other use case, I don't know how exactly this will play out, but one big challenge in developing code is the quality assurance component, right? And some of the people who have to oversee that the code is doing what you want it to do. And so we have all these different like test environments where we try all the different scenarios. I can imagine a future where application like this can just summarize the code for the quality checker, and that would sort of point them to where they needed to dig deep and what interfaces they really needed to test versus things that are, likely bug free. So I think that that would be another potential use case, that we'll get into.
Yeah, and I think quality assurance code is some of the code it writes best. If you literally just sit down and go, "Here's the 20 things I wanna make sure are happening in this code. Here's the edge cases I'm worried about." Like, can you write tests to make sure that the code does that? It'll probably start spitting out some code. So as as a quality assurance checker, someone in compliance, the ability to at least draft code or understand, "Hey, would this code do XYZW?" I think it's gonna be really interesting to see how you can start expanding access to the technical underpinnings of some of these things to non-technical crowds.
Yeah, yeah, I love that.
Another version of agentic behavior that we've seen recently is AI models interacting with other tools and services, kind of like macOS in a different application, but actually whole different applications. In that front, Stripe this week launched an agent toolkit, which is sort of a framework that allows AI agents to interact with, make calls to, get information from, or conduct actions in Stripe, which was, I thought, really interesting, seeing kind of a framework for integrating an AI agent into a third party service and a big service like Stripe.
Yeah, I was actually really surprised. I thought it would be a bit more time before we started to see sort of financial services payment platforms embrace letting, agents use them because there's so many, things related to sort of consumer disclosure and consumer expectation that are at risk here. So I thought this industry might be a little bit nervous to dip their toes in the water, but Stripe has leaned in, which I think is great. And in the forefront of leaning in, they talk about this is how we put controls in place to make sure that the user is still in charge of what they're doing. They have limits. They have notifications and alerts so that they can see what's happening. So that was super interesting to see how they've sort of designed that.
You think others are gonna follow in this space and I mean, it is fascinating to see financial services so early in the space of allowing autonomous agents to actually make financial transactions. That's would have not have been on my bingo card for first use cases.
Yeah, for sure not. Definitely not on my bingo card. I mean, we'll see. Stripe is a pretty big player. So many different fintech providers and bank providers use Stripe, and small businesses use Stripe. So you could see a future where Stripe sort of lays the foundation, and everybody has to follow suit because if it's available in Stripe, you want it to be available elsewhere. But as an industry, financial services tends to be slower to adopt new technologies. So I could also see a future where others are a little bit more nervous to get into things. So we'll see. It's interesting when you sort of read their write up, most of the use cases that they are talking about and advocating for are business use cases. So, booking travel for your employees or, expensing things for your employees as opposed to true consumer use cases. And I think that that's a little bit of a safer first place to start. I do think it'll be a little bit more time before people are comfortable in the consumer use cases. Because, in your consumer use cases, you want people in your flow clicking on your agreements, reading your agreements, and all that type of stuff. And if it's an agent, it makes it a little bit more murky how you retain records that the person understood things and so on and so forth. But I do think the business use case is a little bit safer area for the industry to you know start to dip their toes into the water here.
Maybe a good example of one of the ways you put guardrails on not what the agents are capable of doing, but when you say, "How am I gonna" okay, it's capable of buying things now, but who am I gonna unlock that capability for, is one of the ways you can kinda put guardrails on this thing going wrong, and it's kind of a great example of, how do you think about deploying this in the real world? Maybe it's just employees booking travel, it's already going through the expense app, it's already expenses are gonna get reviewed as they do, pretty low risk area, even though the concept could be expanded to all sorts of areas that would have much more risk, right? But
Yeah,
interesting way to kind of deploy light to start.
yeah, exactly. So, Stripe obviously famously known for making it easier to accept payments, but Perplexity this week is making it easier to make payments. Perplexity launched two shopping related features. So the first is Snap to Shop, which I think is very cool, and basically lets you take a picture of whatever your product is, and then you can find a similar product online or that specific product. So if you see something and you like it and you're not really quite sure where it is or how to find it on Amazon, you can snap to shop with Perplexity. And then the second thing that they released was a Buy with Pro, which is basically a subscription. If you have a Pro subscription to Perplexity, you can buy items directly from the Perplexity interface with just a single click, and all of your, shipping information and payment information is already saved and stored. So you just can buy directly through Perplexity. So
That's fascinating.
it is fascinating. It's interesting to see sort of Perplexity go in this, direction. I was a little bit like, the full power of LLMs, I don't love the use case being, like, for us to buy more stuff, but but I guess it's helpful. And so it's interesting use case, and I think maybe it'd be a thing that a lot of people use. They can figure out how to make money off it to pave the way for more interesting, um future iterations. But what did you think of these?
I'm a pro subscriber, so I mean, I like it, but I thought the most interesting part to me was the business model, which is they're not selling advertising space the way if you think of this as a competitor to Google, and I think Perplexity would very clearly describe themselves as a competitor to Google for consumers. They're not selling ad space, and they're not even making money on the transaction, right? Which they may in the future do. I mean, very common for someone who helps you find a product to charge the merchant as opposed to the consumer. But they're making this available only to their paid consumers, which is also fascinating. I mean, most of these online companies, search companies, have said, let's get as many people on the platform as possible by making the platform free, and then we'll charge all the people who are getting value from it on the merchant side when people find something useful. And Perplexity's gone totally the other way with we're only going to make this super useful feature available to you if you pay us money up front, and then we won't charge the merchants on the back end, which is just a total inversion of the entire business model of the internet. And maybe to your point about not loving us, helping us buy stuff, true. But I mean, I also love not having advertising be, I think the incentives of the advertising business model often run counter to the consumer's best interest. And here they really said, we're only making this feature available if you pay. If it's useful, you keep paying us 20 bucks a month. If not, not, but they're not really incented to help you buy more stuff because you're paying the 20 bucks a month no matter how many times you use this feature. So I thought that was a really interesting difference from the way most online services work today.
Yeah, it is a really interesting difference, and I think that I like that piece of it too, and I also like that because you're paying as the consumer as opposed to them being paid sort of by the merchants, they can, have a little bit of unbiased decision making about what they show you and have it really be showing you something that you've looked for as opposed to, people buying for that space and, the merchants being the influencers of what you see on the
The
internet.
rank ordering. Yeah.
Right, exactly, and this puts a little bit of the power back in the consumer, and I do like that a lot. Obviously don't love that it's, as pricey as it is, but it might go down over time so that more people can use this type of functionality, so we'll see.
Yeah, it definitely puts the power back in the hands of the user. It changes those business alignments and incentives. I'd be really fascinated to say. I don't know how many people will pay 20 bucks a month for how many. I mean, like that's Perplexity, that's Claude, that's Gemini Pro, that's ChatGPT Pro. So if you're an early adopter of the AI technologies today, you're spending 20 bucks a month to a lot of people. So we'll see if that's a sustainable business model for these folks. But the fascinating thing for me is I think the other part of that is you can worry about, well, Perplexity, they'll never make as much money as Google on 20 bucks a month, which is true. Like there's just you're not enough consumers get paid 20 bucks to make the kind of revenue Google makes. But their goal to defeat Google, they don't have to make the same revenue. They just have to serve the same users. If they can do it with fewer people and less costs, then they can totally replace Google without replacing the revenue. I think people will sometimes miss that. They're like, this is way less monetized than Google searches. I go, yeah, but does that matter? Like if that's not their goal, but they'll have to fight the desire to go, oh, if we just put some ads in here, people are calling us up going, I'll pay a lot of money to be first in that shopping result category. And I don't know if they can avoid that temptation, but I do think they could, and they could reduce the monetization a lot of that category and build a very great business that can destroy Google without replacing Google entirely in terms of revenue, which is an interesting element of that business model.
Yeah, it's gonna be interesting, like Perplexity, Claude, Gemini, ChatGPT, who's gonna be the winner in terms of user adoption? Because to your point, nobody's gonna pay 20 bucks a month to all 4. Um, and what features are really important to a consumer to actually make them wanna pay that 20 bucks a month? It's gonna be an interesting thing to see how it plays out. Snap to shop might be worth 20 bucks a month, we'll see.
Yeah, it'll be I mean, I definitely pay them all right now, and I think many people who are early adopters are, and for the listeners, like, if you're curious, I kind of recommend if you can afford it, it's really useful to get all the features for all of them and play them out, but I think long term, that's not sustainable, and so I do think some of the revenue numbers these companies publish when they're raising Perplexity, rumored to be in a fundraising round right now, with a pretty high valuation, and they probably show great, but, revenue growth and retention, but I don't know. I'm very curious how much that is driven by early adopters who have all 4 or 5 and are gonna settle on one that they like, and how sustainable is that? My guess is some of these things are gonna spike a lot as early adopters just try everything for 20 bucks, 40 bucks, 60 bucks, and when you get around the 5th month, you're paying your 100th dollar, you're going, "Eh, I didn't use this one that much. I didn't use this one that much."
Do you have a favorite since you subscribe to all of them?
Uh, I'll tell you, I almost forget that I subscribe to Google's because I never use Gemini. So I hate to say that as a former Googler, but I will say, honestly, it's the last one I think of. I have gone on and off on Perplexity. So it totally replaced Google for me for a while. It's been got a little slower. I stopped using it as much. Right now, I really default to ChatGPT when I have informational type queries, when I'm curious about exploring a topic. The web search I find really good, the digestion of information. And then I use Claude a lot for, like, as a creative partner. So if I'm doing the rundown for this podcast and want some advice on discussion points or news topics to cut, or if I'm thinking about writing an article or drafting a script for a video, I'll go to Claude, and it's actually I find its writing, the prose, and creativity be a little better than ChatGPT's, in my experience. But I found ChatGPT is really great for like instant. It's kind of like Wikipedia on steroids, right? I got some topic that I go, "Hey, I heard this word. I don't really know what it means. Can you like help me out with that?" And man, it's just fantastic, and I use it for that all the time.
Yeah, that's interesting. I actually am similar. I use ChatGPT a lot for research and Claude for more creative discussion-based, idea-based type of things. So,
I don't know if that's a universal thing, but at least for you and I, seems to be the best use cases for them.
yeah.
So last week we talked about a couple of interesting choices by the EU that maybe make it harder to build businesses. Cookie banners. There's a pretty strict AI law in the EU. But despite all that, French startup Mistral launched Pixtral. I love these names. Pixtral Large, which is an LLM that, on at least some benchmarks, outperforms the latest models from ChatGPT and Google Gemini. It's got capabilities like web search, document analysis, image generation. So apparently we need to start paying $20 a month for one more pro model. I don't know. I actually don't know if Mistral has a pro version, but one more, frontier top range model in the mix there from a French startup, no less, not an American one. So interesting.
Yeah, I think it is very interesting. It's nice to see a non-US based model sort of get emerge in the mainstream. I think some of our at Upstart, some of our most amazing data scientists and researchers are French. So I think this is probably pretty good. I have a bias that French data scientists are pretty genius.
I wonder if they'll have an advanced voice mode that comes in a French accent. That'll definitely
Oh,
make it
they need
more
they
appealing.
need that feature. If they don't have it, they should definitely have that feature soon because that's important.
So, I mean, at least the two things I take away from this is one, that high performing models, if people thought that was a differentiator, we just continue to see every time somebody comes out with a high end model, everybody comes along and replicates and sees to be just, it doesn't seem to be a differentiator, at least not a long lasting one as of now. Nobody's broken through some unbelievable barrier and separated from the pack, which really is going to call into question, to your point, like how much am I willing to pay for A versus B if they're the same and there's a C and a D that are all equivalent? Like that's going to be interesting reality if it continues to be true. And most of the developments we see now are actually equal performance from smaller, cheaper models, right? It's not like we're seeing amazing improvements in models. Go, oh, we set this amazing benchmark. Now we did it at half the size, and it's going to be cheaper to run. You go, that's great, but it's not the kind of growth we expected. So I don't know if you've seen that too, but it feels to me like there's just not that much differentiation at the foundational model level at this point.
There isn't. I haven't seen that either. That's why I was so curious, like, what your preference was and if you have any early predictors on who's gonna be the winner, because there doesn't seem like there's a ton of differentiation. There's just kinda small tweaks here and there, so we'll see how, these companies move forward. But on the topic of model performance, another interesting, thing I read this week is that there was a study involving 50 doctors, and, basically, they had doctors who had ChatGPT available to them to diagnose an illness. They had doctors who did not have ChatGPT available to them, and then they had ChatGPT on its own. And they tested these 3 scenarios to see as a diagnostic tool what had the most accuracy. And in a surprise twist, the most accurate diagnosis tool was ChatGPT on its own. You would think it would have been doctors
The two.
supplemented by ChatGPT, but actually, it was just ChatGPT on its own. So this was super fascinating to me. Um, interesting sort of use case. And as I read the article in the Times about this, it was basically saying that one of the problems they went back and they sort of researched all of the inputs that the doctors had put into ChatGPT, and they were really using ChatGPT to sort of ask research-based questions, but maybe to prove their own theory. Like
Oh,
they
fascinating.
had a theory that they were starting with, and they were sort of using ChatGPT to prove their own theory, as opposed to just feeding the problem to ChatGPT and letting ChatGPT do its own thinking. And when it did that, it was more accurate than when it was sort of being used to confirm or deny somebody's existing sort of theory. So that was super interesting to see.
What do you take away from? I mean, that is a fascinating. I discussed this with my wife, who's a doctor who focuses on AI, so we had a long discussion about this particular topic. But what are your key takeaways? Like, what does that tell you about AI accuracy, human accuracy, our own perception of the two? Like, where does that take your mind?
Well, so this is something that I actually think about a lot in the context of the work that I do. And actually, I talk about it a lot in our AI certification course, which is basically that as humans, we have all of this status quo bias, and we have very strong opinions based on our experience to date about, what does and doesn't work and how things should be, and so on and so forth. And we're not always right all the time. Shockingly, right? You can get experts in a field, and they can know more about that field than anybody else, and they're still gonna be wrong sometimes because that's what it means to be human, right? And so, it's gonna be, an interesting sort of corner for us to turn to
Mhm.
try to debias ourselves and assume that we might not know all the answers and leverage a technology like this to help provide us answers. We have a value at Upstart, be smart and know you might be wrong. And I think that this is like the thing about using LLMs, right? You might know a lot and the LLM might know more, right? Or it might
Yeah, yeah.
be able to connect different dots for you. This comes up in the context, as you know, about inputting variables into a model to assess creditworthiness. This is like a primary use case that I see routinely. And what happens is you might see a variable that the machine learning model says this is a very strong predictor of credit performance, right? This variable says that the person will be X likely to default or Y likely not to default. And in general, when you see a variable that's very strongly correlated to creditworthiness, you want to use it in the model.
Of course.
But then you have all of the human intuition that are like, I don't understand how that relates to creditworthiness. And so therefore I'm afraid to put it in the model because there's no intuitive connection in my brain. And I think the question becomes like, does there really need to be an intuitive connection in every person's brain? Or is it enough to be able to see that the math clearly supports, the data clearly supports that this variable is predictive of this outcome?
It's a fascinating question, especially when we know that some of the things for which we have the strongest intuitive prediction that they're valuable sometimes turn out to be not that valuable. So we know at
Right.
least in the other direction, our intuition can be quite wrong.
Yeah, yeah, it is. It's super interesting, and I think you can clearly see how this would happen in the medical profession because if you're a doctor and you have X many patients, even if you've been doing it for years and years and years, there's probably not any doctor that has literally seen it all, right? And
We hope
so
not.
we hope not, right? And so you're always biased by your previous experience, not because there's anything wrong with you or because you're a bad doctor, but just because that's what happens with humans. We learn from our experience. And so then we're biased from our experience. And so having access to a tool like ChatGPT, where it's not biased by its experience, it just literally is looking at data. It can have a much more objective sort of set of facts to present forward. So super interesting use case to do this.
The other thing that comes to my mind when I hear this story is that the need to put some sort of tooling that an LLM on its own is often not the answer, even if the knowledge and capabilities are stored in an LLM. That, part of what could have made this result better for the human and the chat GPT together was a structure for doctors not just going in and trying to confirm their own biases, for maybe structured data about the patient and the history, not relying on the doctor to go, oh, type in a paragraph and go, oh, here's the context of the test results we've had, the history of the patient, the demographics of the patient, which can really matter, age, illness history, things like that. And, you know, the doctor may not have put all that in. That's not, I just want to know this one little thing that I'm trying to confirm or disconfirm a theory. And that happens to anybody in any context. And these models really perform so much better when they're given a fuller context. And that's one of the reasons I'm very bullish about things like Copilot or just the integration of the LLMs into existing tooling where you can bring that kind of context as opposed to relying on the user to be smart about how do I prompt? How's this tool going to be most effective in assisting me in my task? It's like, no, we need to, put some structure around how that tool gets used. Cause I bet there's a way to design this where it actually would be the doctor with ChatGPT that was far more accurate, but it's not just giving an open prompt to the doctor and going, good luck using ChatGPT. We hope it makes you more accurate. Like that's not clearly the answer here, but I think that doesn't mean the LLM couldn't be helpful and they couldn't be best to have them both together.
Yeah, 100%. And actually, I think so much of work that we need to do in terms of training people how to use AI generally is just what you're saying, the guidebook, right? How do you use this tool most effectively? Don't use it in this narrow use case, use it broader. That's sort of why we're doing our hands-on segments every week.
Yeah, yeah.
A quick word from our sponsor. This podcast is brought to you by Upstart, the leading AI lending marketplace that connects millions of consumers to banks and credit unions that leverage Upstart's AI technology to deliver superior credit products. Their platform includes personal loans, automated retail and refinance loans, home equity lines of credit, and small dollar relief loans. For more information, head over to www.upstart.com.
This week, you have a good one for us, and I'm really excited to dig into it. So tell me about our hands-on this week, Jeff.
So this is one I think you and I both used for a while, but it's called Notebook LM
Love
from
it.
Google. It is a really cool and fun tool. So for those who are less familiar, it is a service where you can upload documents, multiple though not a ton. I don't know what the exact limit is. Typically, you upload PDFs or YouTube videos, and then it can the fundamental when they released it, the core functionality was you could just ask questions about it, right? Like, "Summarize this for me," whatever it might be. "What do you think of this things? What are the top 5 recommendations for this?" Whatever, things like that. So, easy way to interact with PDFs.
I like it. And what kind of PDFs have you fed into it? As you mentioned, we both use this and like this functionality. What have you fed it?
I wanna hear you. So, the first one I fed it was actually like a 160-page document from Stanford called the Stanford Emerging Technology Report. It had sections on, like, bioscience and nuclear energy and, you know, neuroscience, and I was material sciences, and I was like, "It's really interesting. What's going on in the world in these things?" And that was, like, 160 pages, and I was like, "Yeah, that's not happening." Uh, so I fed it in, like, what are the key insights? What would I not know? Whatever. So really interesting. Then I recently fed it the Department of Education's AI toolkit for schools and school districts just to see how are they recommending AI be used. I know it's quite interesting
Yeah,
to see
that's
what it can do.
super interesting. I like to use it for consent orders, right? Like companies get consent orders or lawsuits get filed, and they're often a lot of pages with a lot of context,
Yeah.
and a lot of it is superfluous, and you don't really need to read it. But you in the old days had to read all 100 pages to find the 3 pages of really valuable content. So that's the type of stuff I like to feed into Notebook LM, and then you just ask it anything, right?
Ask
Like,
whatever you want.
yeah.
Not only informational, but sometimes like what are the pros and cons of the recommendations in here? Or how could you critically analyze the recommendations for using AI in the classroom in this report? And it'll actually do some thoughtful analysis as well as just the basic summarize the key points. So here's the key takeaways you might have.
Yeah. The other feature about Notebook LM that, I love that I'm curious if you've tried as well is that it can actually take whatever the pages that you've, uploaded to it, and instead of summarizing it in text, it can make it into a podcast. Have you
Yeah,
tried
I
this?
I have, and I worry for our roles here because it's pretty good. Uh,
It's pretty good.
yeah, so this is probably I mean, many of the LLMs now can do the kind of basic PDF reading and summary, but this
Yep.
was really the core thing that set Notebook LM apart was it has a two-person, just, little bantering podcast, and it's surprisingly it's surprisingly good.
It is, it's surprisingly good, and I love it, and, for people who are super busy, I'm pretty busy, I'm always trying to look for ways to multitask, and how do I make sure I can get 2 things done at once, and so, you have some 100-page thing you gotta read for work, and you gotta know the information, feed it into Notebook LM, get a podcast, go for your run, you're, killing 2 birds with 1 stone, it's amazing.
It is remarkable, and one of the things so when I heard it, I went, "This is like, how is it doing this?" And I think it's another example, we were talking in the story from about the doctors about it's not just an LLM. Well, this isn't just feeding the document into the context window of the LLM, but if you look at how it does the podcast, it actually takes it and goes it has, like, multi-series of prompts that it runs in the background, to kind of summarize and to, like, write a podcast outline for what you might talk about, and then to, like, refine the outline with certain things. So it actually does like a self-editing process. And then my favorite, when the product manager was describing this, my favorite thing is they added what they called, I want to say it was called decoherence at the end, which is what inserted the like banter and off, little jokes and little asides and the kind of humor that kind of I think make a podcast more than just like a reading of bullet points. It's that interaction. And that's if you listen to it, the hosts have that. I mean, they go back and forth and they make jokes and they laugh at each other and they reference things and it feels much more human than I would have thought. But it was fascinating to me how many steps in the AI process. It's not just like a model that does it. It's multiple models with multiple steps being iterated in a process to generate that. But it is a remarkable thing to be able to take, 160-page document and go, if the authors were to be brought on a podcast, like what would it sound like and what would I learn? And you could just get a podcast out of it.
It's so amazing. So there you go. We end this week on the note that Notebook LM is coming for our jobs.
It's coming for, I guess, maybe I'll see you next week. Maybe I won't. But just,
We'll
maybe
see.
we'll attempt a podcast where we have it just do the rundown and do the whole thing, and we see how we put it out there and see if people like that episode versus ours. I mean,
Yeah, we
yeah,
can do an A/B test, right?
do an
Us
A/B
versus
test
Notebook
on
LM.
Annie and Jeff versus the versus Notebook LM podcast model. We'll see.
I love it.
Well, until then,
Great.
Annie, we'll see you next week.
See you next week. Good to see you.
This podcast is brought to you by Upstart. If you'd like to take a deeper dive into the fundamentals of AI, check out the AI Certification for Financial Services course Upstart released at aicertification.upstart.com. Again, that's aicertification.upstart.com. If you like this episode, please leave us a rating or review. It's the best way to help others find us. And finally, if you have topics you'd like to see covered or questions you'd like to have answered, drop us a line at email@whattheai.fm. That's it. We'll see you guys next time.